Anytime. We were trying to wait until 7 here.
It's after 7.
My clock says 6:59. Yeah, I'm watching.
Your watch is wrong.
That's my phone.
It's wrong. I'm just saying.
But I'm not alone with that time.
It's still wrong.
Good evening. Holy moly, that's a loud one. I can adjust my voice, Gary. Okay. Well, welcome. We're so delighted to see so many people out. Gary's been reminding me that we're live on the website, so we need to get going. So I hope anybody coming later will just seat themselves and make themselves comfortable. Tonight we are welcoming Sarah, the Reverend Dr. Sarah Travis, and she's recently become the Associate Professor, Ewart Chair of Practice Ministry and Faith Formation at Knox College. It isn't about But we all know her as Sarah. Many of us know her as Sarah, who was here at Knox as a student minister many, many years ago. And her family, of course, growing family. We had Paul in the choir, and I always remember that Paul was singing so many different parts. Sarah gave him the ultimatum, if you sing soprano, I'm out. So, yes. But we welcome Sarah back into what was once a family home for her and a worship home. And we're looking forward to discussing Unsettling Worship tonight. So thank you, Sarah, for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's so great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces as well. Forgive me if I forget names. Do you know that it's been over 20 years since I was a student here?
No.
I hung around for a while after that, but yeah, I've been at Knox College now on and off for 24 years. So it's about time they gave me a good title. So I have some notes that I've written. I'm going to talk to you for a little while, and then I'm going to open it up for conversation. You may not agree with everything I say, and that's just fine, and there will be time to share those different thoughts and ideas as we go. My presentation is called Being Unsettled, Worship and the Body of Christ. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my new book, Unsettling Worship. Before I forget, I want to tell you that this project was funded by the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship, which runs out of Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Fantastic institution. They have a grant program that offers money to worshiping congregations and to teacher scholars, and this was the Teacher Scholar Grant. So I'm so grateful to them for the funding that allowed me to do certain things that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So I want to begin by acknowledging the land that we are gathering on. This land acknowledgement is the one used at Trinity St. Paul's and Bloor Street United Church. So it's more or less local, but not quite as local as it could be. As we assemble in this holy place, we recognize that for thousands of years, this territory has been a sacred gathering for many peoples of Turtle Island. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of several Indigenous nations and wish to pay special recognition to the Mississauga of the New Credit. The original nations continue to cry out for justice. As treaty people, we commit to listen, learn, and work to right the wrongs of the past and the present. We offer an acknowledgement of the land because we recognize that we are not the first or the last inhabitants of this land. We are connected to others through histories of friendship and destruction. To acknowledge the land is to honor the relationships that are at the heart of the process of conciliation. or more commonly, reconciliation. And I'll talk more about why I chose the word conciliation in a minute. In the land acknowledgement that I just read, there is a promise and a commitment made to work to right the wrongs of past and present. I'm using the term conciliation more often than I'm using the more traditional term reconciliation. So the difference is, I'm going to read a quote by an Indigenous theologian called Mark Charles. And he points out, quote, "Because the more familiar term racial reconciliation implies a pre-existing harmony and unity, we propose the use of the term racial conciliation. Conciliation does not happen without truth-telling. Conciliation without truth is trying to bring health without a comprehensive diagnosis. Truth-telling requires the deeper examination of the existing narratives and the unearthing of the dysfunction surrounding those narratives. The broken system and the dysfunctional theological imagination from which that broken system emerges. That dysfunctional theological imagination. I love that phrase. Once that broken system is uncovered, an authentic lament rooted in truth can commence. Lament, therefore, emerges from the confrontational nature of truth and our honest response to that truth. Truth-telling will liberate the church to write a more biblical narrative that will integrate the lost practice of lament, the power of a shared journey, and the building of a common memory. So that was a lot of words. What it's actually saying is that we talk about conciliation because there actually isn't a pre-existing good relationship between settlers and Indigenous people. It never was there in a positive, healthy way. And so reconciliation implies that there was something there to be reconciled. Conciliation suggests that we're building something new, which is actually kind of exciting. And I think that that quote by Mark Charles kind of starts to talk about what reconciliation is. He talks about the lost practice of lament, the power of a shared journey, and the building of a common memory. Those are some of the things that we do together when we're working on reconciliation or conciliation. Until recently, I served on the steering committee of Kairos Canada. Some of you might be familiar with that. It's an ecumenical justice and advocacy organization. And last year we attended 2 days of training aimed at preparing us for the work of conciliation. It was incredibly intense, led by 3 Indigenous women storytellers who shared through story and song their own identities, and they tried to get a very mixed group of staff and board members to think through their own relationship to Indigenous people. This was quite the process. But my key takeaway from this training is that conciliation begins with us. It begins in us, with our own decolonizing of our minds. We must, as individuals, confront our own fragilities and assumptions, our own way of being in the world. And this involves becoming self-aware and self-critical, things that people tend not to be very good at. This work is ours alone to do, and yet we accomplish it in community. As much as this work is personal, it is also communal. In the church, we are bound to one another in special ways, and thus our working out of conciliation happens at both the individual and the corporate level. In other words, we are not alone, and we need each other's support and mutual critique. So the community that I'm talking about specifically in this book is the worshiping community. I've done a lot of writing recently about the body of Christ. When we're baptized, we become part of this strange kind of body. A body that exists as a reality in the world. It's the church, but it's in human form. The body of Christ is all of us and all those other people, those other Christians on the other side of the world or the other side of the street or the other side of the tracks. We are mysteriously formed into one body that is intended to resemble Jesus Christ. And each part is important. The body cannot function in a healthy way unless each part of the body is healthy. Think of your own bodies and what happens to you if you have a toothache. The rest of your body doesn't function very well. If one part of the body is starved of nutrients, that's not going to go well. If one part of the body suffers violence, that's not going to go well. Self-care of Christ's body is a baptismal practice. That is, as baptized members of Christ's body, we are responsible for protecting and nurturing that whole body. So if one part is suffering, we're meant to send all our resources to that broken or suffering part so that it may be healed. In my newest book, not this one, the one that just got sent to the publisher, I argue that the body of Christ has been broken. In that book, I'm talking specifically about the way that theological debates about human sexuality have broken and bruised the church, as well as attitudes like homophobia and transphobia. The body of Christ in the world is vulnerable to suffering. We don't often think of the church as a vulnerable body, but we've all lived it. We know it is. We know how imperfect and prone to suffering we can be as a people, as a body of Christ. So colonialism is one of those things that has harmed the church, the body of Christ. As you know, children were removed from their families and communities and forced into residential schools that did untold harm to children. Many, many died. And others suffered various abuses, including the abuse of being removed from their cultures and their languages. White Christians thought they knew best, and in their arrogance they tried to get Indigenous children to think and behave like white children. The body of Christ was broken as one part of that body caused harm to another part. And in this case, I'm referring specifically to the relationships among Indigenous Christians and settler Christians. So sometimes we forget that there's a whole body of the church, a whole branch of the church that is Indigenous. And so in enacting those residential schools, we actually harmed some of our own, as well as harming a whole lot of other children. So the body of Christ metaphor is helpful for thinking through relationships within the church. But what about our relationship with other groups and faith and traditions? That matters just as much. I didn't learn about any of this sin and brokenness in school. We heard stories about friendly pioneers and explorers who discovered North America and made friends with the native people, and they all ate turkey together. Anybody else learn those kind of stories? It was not until I was almost an adult and I attended the 1994 General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada that I heard about how the church had participated in colonization in general and residential schools in particular. The church made a confession that year to God and to Indigenous people outlining its sins and mistakes. That was 30 years ago. 30 years ago. And I'm not sure that we've learned as much as we should have in those 3 decades. Indigenous people who live in the bounds of Canada are still suffering in many ways the aftermath of colonialism, as well as the way that colonialism is ongoing. This project arose because I began to do preparatory work within myself. And I found that I wanted to do more to encourage congregations to engage in the difficult work of conciliation or reconciliation. We are all aware of the urgency of the situation, and I'm not going to name all the ways that Indigenous people continue to be negatively impacted by colonialism, but there are countless examples. Residential schools and the ongoing impact of that colonial violence are now part of the national consciousness. And yet, conciliation still feels like a distant dream. I was just beginning this project when the news of the discovery of the children's bodies in Kamloops was announced in May 2021. I think all of us struggled to know how to respond to that news. Certainly from the pulpit, I know that for clergy it was a very difficult time because we need to say something. But it's very difficult to locate any good news at all in that story. And that's what preaching is all about, is preaching the good news of Jesus Christ. But where is the good news in this circumstance? I think the discovery of the children's bodies raised important questions for Canadian Christians about our own identities and our participation in colonial systems, as well as questioning the role of the church in these systems. The church must find a way to respond to these questions about ethics and identity. We must continue to preach gospel even in the face of trauma and tragedy. Reconciliation is gospel news. It's the truth of God's being with us and for us in relationship. Notice that when I'm talking about our relationship with God, I'm using that word reconciliation again. Because God's reconciliation to us is complete. Our reconciliation with each other is incomplete. But all of our relationships are rooted in that one relationship with the divine. And conciliation or reconciliation only becomes possible because God has acted first to reconcile with us. I was really reluctant at first to do this kind of research because I wondered what, as a white woman, I could possibly contribute to this conversation. But it became very clear very quickly that this was my work to do. Some of you may have heard of Margaret Mullen, who is an Indigenous minister in Winnipeg. Her Indigenous name is Thundering Eagle Woman. So Thundering Eagle Woman made it very clear to me that I need to do this work because I am a white woman, because I have been part of the damage and therefore part of the healing. So the truth is, this project is not about Indigenous people. I don't know a lot of Indigenous people, although I do have some relationships. This project is all about white people, about settlers. I don't know Indigenous communities, but I know white settler communities. In essence, I'm asking, what do settlers need to do within their own communities to begin the work of conciliation? How do people like me begin to work on ourselves in community? This book is intended to help settlers do the work of decolonizing worship in predominantly settler churches in North America. Thus, my work does not directly impact Indigenous peoples, but rather aims at reforming settler practices, white people's practices and attitudes, so that settlers may go into the world beyond the sanctuary, ready to be formed and strengthened in relationships with Indigenous people. So in other words, we need to do the work so that we can be prepared to go and have relationships with Indigenous people. If, indeed, Indigenous people are willing to have those conversations with us. I just want to note that this project is not about incorporating Indigenous practices into worship. Although that is a very interesting topic of conversation, I would never seek to include Indigenous practices in worship without the guidance of elders and knowledge keepers from Indigenous communities. But this project does ask how Indigenous theology and practice offers a critique of the worship that's most familiar to us. Now, I've used a lot of very loaded words so far. Reconciliation, conciliation, settler, worship. I've talked about reformed worship, or maybe I skipped that word reformed. We're talking about reformed worship. We're talking about colonialism. We're talking about Indigenous people. And I don't have time to define those terms, although within the context of the project I meant very specific things by them. But I thought in a little while we'll have a little bit of a conversation so that we can get a sense not of what those terms mean exactly, but the variety of ways that we understand those terms. Because all of us will have different definitions and different understandings of those terms. I invite you to pay attention to how you respond to those terms in your own body. When you hear the word settler, how does that sit with you? A lot of people find that a very uncomfortable word. Reformed worship probably is a little more neutral. No one gets that excited about Reformed worship. Or maybe they do. So none of these terms are easily defined, and there's a lot of diversity in the literature. So there aren't necessarily right answers. But I do want to just say a few things about worship, just to situate the project really firmly in that area of worship. So first of all, I believe that worship is formative. It shapes us into a community. Over time, we become who we are because of worship. And there's a particular ethic involved in worship. When the body of Christ worships, there's an ethic of care implied by our baptism that we will look after one another. Worship is not confined to the worship space and time. It continues day by day, hour by hour. Worship is about identity. It tells us who we are and to whom we belong. Worship is about connection to God and others. I just want to share a couple of things that this project has taught me. It's taught me a lot of things about the shape of worship and its content and the ways that worship can equip us for better relationships with Indigenous peoples. For example, the prayer of confession is vitally important, not only because it gives us an opportunity to name our sins out loud, but it reminds us that God is always reconciling God's self to us. There's a constant process of reconciliation, divine to human, always happening. And as we are reconciled to God, we are equipped for the work of being reconciled to others, or conciled to others, forming relationships with others. But just as important is the assurance of pardon, which immediately follows the prayer of confession. And it is a promise. It is an assurance that we have been forgiven and we are made free to begin all over again. I've learned a lot about the importance of the land. This is so important in Indigenous spirituality and so vitally important to the whole project of reconciliation. Land matters. We are creatures of a divine creator, and our work as a human community is never separate from our relationship to the land. And this has tremendous implications for churches who occupy real estate. The land acknowledgement is not only a way of honoring relationship to others, it's a way of honoring our own relationship to the land. I really struggle with this part. I was on a meeting with a lot of people who are very justice oriented and really understand all of these concepts well in their own lives. And they were able to rattle off their land acknowledgement for where they lived. They were able to name the land as being important to them. But when I introduce myself, I realized I skipped over geography altogether. I never mentioned where I was from or where I grew up. If you're talking to an Indigenous person, they will always start by telling you where they are from, what land they belong to. So this project really made me think about the importance of the land. We live very far away from the land. Some of you are gardeners. I know some of you are gardeners. You have a little more of a sense of what it means to dig your hands into the dirt and belong to it. Others of us are not close to the land. I thought meat came in little packages, little packages, you know? That's about how close I get to the land. So it's something to think about. And finally, I have learned that the shape of worship draws us in and sends us out in a rhythm, like a heartbeat. And by this rhythm of worship, we're prepared to do the work of conciliation because we are continually sent out toward others and drawn back into community. And in this productive and sacred space between the end of worship and its beginning, so when we leave worship on a Sunday and we come back the next Sunday, in that space in between, that's where the work happens. That's where we are sent into the world to be reconciled, to be ambassadors of God's reconciling love, seeking restorative solidarity with Indigenous people. So those are just some of my somewhat random thoughts. And I wanted to leave lots of room for discussion and questions and wondering. And I'm happy to hear what you thought of the book. I'm really happy to hear your kind of insights about all these hard words I've been using and the different ways that we understand them. I'm curious to hear about your gut reactions to these words.
One of the sections you have is about music.
Mm-hmm.
And the words in some of our hymns, and you mentioned some of the language might be imperialistic or militaristic, and I don't know the timetable for a new version or edition of the hymnal, but we still have Onward Christian Soldiers in our current hymnal, and that's pretty militaristic, so I don't know if there would be any kind of a review made of the lyrics in some of our hymns.
Yeah, you know, I have a feeling there will never be another Presbyterian hymnal. And the reason I say that, I actually hope there isn't, because what I mean is that I think in terms of how it's used in congregations, that it would be wiser for the church to have a collection of songs that were available online that can be downloaded and used, rather than publishing a traditional hymn book again. But, I mean, really, it's the work of the worship leaders to do that hard naming of songs that may not be as timely as they once were. You know, I'll never forget. You all remember Helen Goggin, of course, preaching a gorgeous sermon on peace one Sunday here, and she sat down and the choir stood up and they sang the battle hymn of the Republic. And I still use that as an example in my worship class. When you have to talk to each other about what's happening in worship.
It's funny you would talk about the hymns, Phil, but it isn't, because we're in the choir and we think about the hymns. But the one, when you mentioned How Great Thou Art, I immediately pulled up the words, because I thought, I don't think there's anything wrong with that hymn. And so that's where I wanted to hear why, you know, but I think it was somebody else had written a segment about How Great Thou Art. But I remember looking at it and thinking, I think in Indigenous culture there's a great spirit. There's a, you know, there is something that's greater than we are. And so for me, although it's not one of my favorite, you know, must-have hymns, I didn't see issue with it. And even, but I do see the kind of lordship and that being an issue because of the connotations. And sometimes, even though it's not making me uncomfortable in my white place, it could be making someone else uncomfortable. And we don't want to hurt others. And sometimes what makes us quite at ease and happy is not making someone else happy. So
Right.
yeah.
And some of these hymns have a history of traveling from one place to another and being imposed on a particular population. I struggled with writing that music part, and honestly, I can't remember what I said about How Great Thou Art. But
I happen to know what page
oh, you
it's on.
happen to know what page?
I don't know if I want to read all of it, but
Do you want me to read it?
sure. This is where it starts, and it's more down here, I think, that it starts about how great thou art.
All right. Let's see. What we sing tells us who we are. Many European ecclesial traditions, their ethos, hymns, Bibles, interpretations, liturgies, and doctrines went hand in hand with the colonial enterprise to affirm production, control, and domination consciously or unconsciously. That was a quote from a book on Christian worship. It can be problematic when our hymns and songs contain imperial or triumphalistic imagery. Favorite hymns such as How Great Thou Art can be seen to present God as distant and superior, reinforcing the kind of theological hierarchy that undergirded European colonialism, placing God at the top of the hierarchy with white men just a little bit lower.
Don't read my notes.
No, I'm not.
I don't agree with that.
So Christians become subjects invited into the imperial throne room of the divine emperor. Anybody have thoughts on that? It's a bit hard. Some of these ideas are a bit hard to absorb at our baseline existence level, I think. when I read that out loud, it sounds a bit ridiculous to me. It sounded like it made a lot of sense when I was in my little ivory tower writing it. But to be in conversation about music and how music makes us feel about God and how music structures our understanding of who God is. And part of where I'm coming from there is when I talk about God being at the top of a hierarchy, of course God's at the top of a hierarchy, but white people are not next in line. Jackie?
Yeah, I think the goal then is, at least when I'm trying to pick hymns and such, if we're gonna have a hymn like that, have other, make sure the other hymns in the service do not mirror that same ethos, right? So do one that might have kind of that cosmic God feel. Have
Right.
another one that has, the next one might have more of a servant, leader, foot washing,
Me and
brother,
Jesus.
Jesus, like a little more intimate,
Yeah.
Jesus and the disciples, brother, sister, let me serve you.
Yeah.
Something that's a little more, something you can touch,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think balance is what helps that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, because I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We've done that before as reformers, and
Yeah, we have. I lost a lot of good things along the way, like art.
yeah, yeah.
There's so
So
many
balance.
other things besides, I was wondering as you were speaking, when first the settlers, the new settlers came in, my ancestors say,
Mm-hmm.
I'm fifth generation down on Prince Edward Island, so I know who came at the beginning. But I wonder if they didn't, if the Indian people didn't welcome them in, like we welcome in now different people from different countries, from different nations. We see they need a place more than, and we have more land maybe than they have, or a place that we can deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any real history of that, of them welcoming?
Yes, and I'm not a historian, but there are examples, and I think in general, there was a welcoming that happened. It just became awkward very quickly when it became clear that the settlers wanted everything.
Well, I have an example for the island, partly because the Indians lived in a very real interesting spot just across the harbor, and they could get into town quite easily in their boats and whatever. But the government decided that was a port, an original port or something, and they dispersed them all the way up to another part of the island where they had nothing.
Right.
Now
Right.
that was domination.
Right.
Just hand this around as we put on.
Yes, good idea, good idea. Yeah, that's a really good example, and that displacement was,
That's right.
happened over and over again. And I think where there might have been friendships,
And
they
that
were
was by the
betrayed.
time of the third or the fourth generation that happened.
Okay,
But,
yeah,
yeah, they got, so that they thought it was theirs and they just took it. It was terrible because I had gotten to know some of those Indian people. In fact, one of them one time was sitting at the end of the war and she said, I said, when's the next boat coming? It should be here soon. She said, the boat, come back.
oh,
So I had to knock on somebody's door and find a ride and around to Charlottetown, which was 25 or 26 kilometers away.
oh my goodness.
For myself, my mother, and my sister, and a friend. And my mother said she was never going again with me.
So the boat really didn't come?
The boat didn't come, no, it was the last boat had left earlier.
Oh,
Nice predicament. But the Indian people were so friendly. Like she stood at the dock and she just was talking to me like a friend.
yeah,
They were a very friendly community, and they visited Charlottetown because we were just across the harbor, and they'd be back and forth. They were in and around the city a lot.
mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, we don't see any of them because they're way up at the other end of the island, way off on the side.
Right.
So let's hope we go the other way, that we become more bringing in and pushing. Even if there's some effort on that part of the, of the story, I think that would be good.
Absolutely, and I mean, one of the things that I confess in this book, and confess to you all already, I've said I don't know a lot of Indigenous people, and I think that's probably true for many of us. And how do we begin to have those relationships? I mean, one of the ways that we can, the way that's closest to us is to form relationships with other Christians.
I have a story for that.
Oh, good.
Of course you do.
Joe's going to give you a microphone.
I was swimming, three of us were swimming without any supervision at one of the shores outside on the rim of Charlottetown. And I had gotten, the tide had come in the meantime, and I couldn't get into shore. And an Indian girl dove off a raft that was way out and caught me and took me in, and without her help I wouldn't be here.
Wow.
So I have a real debt to those people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because the others couldn't get out far enough. They were trying to reach out to me without drowning themselves.
Oh my
Because
goodness.
the tide had come in so quickly.
Yeah, that's terrifying.
Yeah, it scared us. Yeah. Well, I was scared because I was going gulping and, and finally she just, this arms came around me and took me in.
Oh, what a great story.
Yeah. And she was very Indian, like she was really good person.
Well, I'm glad she did that.
I am too.
Warren's really glad.
You were talking earlier about the connection to the land, and like you, I'm not really feeling I'm that connected to the land, although to a certain extent, we've had a cottage since I was very young, and so I'm connected to the land there when we're on vacation or away there, but not so much here. Partly that's just because transportation has just evolved so much that, when you think of it, when I was commuting from Burlington to North York, I mean, I'm crossing several creeks at very high speed that in the old days would have taken several hours to go down the bank, get across, come up the other side. It's just incredible when you think of it. You pass over the Credit River in about 30 seconds,
Yeah.
and it would have taken them half a day to get down one side, across the water, and up the other side. It's just changed that so much. So, and I don't know who was in our area. I do know that, the Mohawks came up with Joe Brand in a kind of deal with the British, and that they had slaves. And they're kind of on the, down by the Grand River, but my encounter with Indigenous people, really was one night while working, on a trip in Winnipeg. There was a lot of drunken Indigenous people out on the street. And I didn't associate with them because I wouldn't associate with white settlers who were drunken on the street either.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe some of that had to do with the traumas in their families, but we didn't know about that. Or certainly not as kids, we didn't hear anything about any of that. I sometimes wonder if, when I was in high school, there was a high school teacher we had who taught history, and there was some really interesting stuff around the Indian Act, which was I was surprised at the time, but I kind of got into it. And I think John Chrétien was actually the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, and they were trying to do some things. I think in '69, they actually abolished the Indian Act, if I remember. So the government was actually, a long time ago, trying to figure out ways to dismantle some of this mess. But they probably, obviously didn't go far enough. And I guess I've always wondered, when you were talking about the idea of the emperor and all that, we would never think of those hymn words, the emperor, we wouldn't think of it that way. We don't think of our government as emperor. To a certain extent, we think of ourselves as having a franchise on the government through our vote. taxes and all that kind of stuff. And that got me thinking at the time, back when I was in high school, all of this welfare for the Indigenous people isn't going to help them because they're going to feel they're disenfranchised, like as if it's a parental kind of control, and that they don't have a thing to stand up and say, no, you can't do this, because they have a franchise like the government, like the rest of us who are working hard and paying taxes and, voting.
Right.
So I've always felt for a long time, although I understand the idea of, let's give them money or help support them or whatever, but I don't think it helps them. I think you get generational welfare going on, and they don't feel like they have a voice. And if they don't feel like they have a voice, they're always going to feel like the lesser or the,
Right.
not seen and
Right.
not heard. Yeah.
Right.
So anyway.
May I answer something to that?
Wait just a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just one point in terms of the generational welfare. I think the generational welfare has been going on for a long time, but at the same time, we're still enacting policies that do harm and damage to Indigenous communities. Like the ongoing pipeline project the federal government does is just an attack on Indigenous communities, whether it be capital seeking or not. So while we can still do all of the good work to do Band-Aids for the problems that we cause, we continue to cause problems, which doesn't undo the need for the help that we're paying in the first place.
Except with some of the pipelines, some of the Indigenous groups want it. I mean,
Right.
well, there's 300 plus tribes. They're not
Yes.
one group.
And that's such an important point, is that we're
Yeah.
talking about a diverse group of
Absolutely. And in
But-
some of those cases, some of the groups want the pipeline, others don't. I mean,
yeah,
Yeah.
true.
Well, this is where we're going to really disagree. First place, to understand Indigenous people is to understand a lot of the things we do share, and that is land, the value of land, the value of family, the value of having their community and our community and the way they treat each other. And particularly on issues when I started, when I really thought about it was in the 70s when I was in environmental studies. Their land, they were protecting their land from the Mackenzie Valley to whatever because of the issues, is that they understood the land is being destroyed. You talk about pollution today, 45, 50 years later, we use the word pollution. And they're fighting to keep the earth a good place to live. And to believe in that and share those values, we do share them. We just don't recognize that we do. And many times about economics, come on, they just woke up and said, we can actually make some money here to be able to do something with our communities. But we're giving them self-government. They have strong self-government. They have strong values. And particularly are often maternal. They're much more female-driven than they are male-driven, in spite of what the movies say. It's a time of sitting down and communicating with them and sharing worship with them. And we went over to the center, right, recently, and that was a fantastic example of exactly how people lived and how they needed to work together to survive the weather and everything else, and even having their own community and their own areas. And I don't say their areas. They don't believe in lots of fences here. They believe in the earth, and they believe in a lot of shared. And we used to have to do even how you communicate. They communicate in a circle. They would never
Rows.
They don't do rows. You sit and you talk to someone beside you. And I remember having seminars in the union where we were talking. We had people come in and who were from that community, and they explained to us how we can communicate better with each other. And we actually adopted some of those. It's something about not understanding. And today it doesn't matter whether you're an immigrant, because now we treat immigrants kind of like if they were indigenous. Why are you in my land? This is my space. This is how we do things. We can learn from each other, and that's, I think, the communication that comes from it. But to know that, for instance, we are outraged that all these children were found in those grave sites. We have a shared outrage about that, and that's not right. We have to find a better way to open up and communicate and to
talk about it and to listen. They're very much about listening and communicating. So there's a lot of like just false and inappropriate thoughts about people because you don't know them until you meet them, until you're in their homes and you've had a meal and you've been there. I've had that opportunity because I had a job that covered the whole province, and I was privileged to know these people. And I mean, I will go back and see a few of them, right? And they're for anywhere else, they're funny, they're supportive, they love their children, and they suffer from some of the serious issues that we have. But economics is one of them, and it's like, but I'll use the final example is water.
Yeah.
We expect to have clean water. If you've been in the French River District, they still don't have clean water after the government said they would do that, 50 years ago? You can't guarantee you have fresh water. If you don't have fresh water, you have a lot of problems in your community. And that's just an example. We need to share and believe in it and make sure that everyone has certain basic rights. And the right to even elect, the right to make sure you have good schooling and have an opportunity and an input into your, I have a friend that's a school principal and her specialty is working with Indigenous people. And she's a great, great principal, and she trained all the teachers to work with them. Their grades are great. It's a way, and we need to open our eyes and use our ears and go, oh, I never thought about that. So that's the end of my rant.
Hear, hear.
And I think that one of the ways that we can easily do this, most of this is hard work that will be hard to organize, but just reading what has been written by Indigenous people. There's a book called From the Ashes. Has anyone read that book? Jessie Thistle, I think, is the... I have never been struck more by the notion of intergenerational trauma as I was reading that book. In fact, at various... I kept forgetting I was reading something that this man had written because I thought he was going to die over and over in this book. The trauma and the terrible things that happened to him. And I had to keep reminding myself, no, he survived because he wrote the book. It's okay, Sarah. It's okay. But that's one way. That's one small way. Now, Roma, why don't you finish what you wanted to say?
I was going to tell you that when I was taking courses at Knox College, we took one from a chap that was an Indian. He was a doctor in whatever he was in, social work or something. But he gave us a lecture, and he was a member of the Quadiyutal Indians in the West. And he said, you never hear of them because we are very well organized, we are very well educated, and we look after our communities like no other Indian population in Canada. He was very of his own, unlike that about Prince Edward Island.
Right.
So there are some good stories.
There are excellent stories, and the stories of survival, and I've written about trauma as well, but there's the whole notion of post-traumatic growth, that good, positive things can come out of even the worst situations, and I find that to be very, very powerful. Jan.
What I knew about Native people and Indians, growing up in Holland, it was from books and movies about cowboys and Indians, right? And then when I came to Canada, I didn't know anything about it. And even, I must say, at Knox College, I cannot remember, when I was there, a lot of discussion about Native people and Native issues. Now, I know I skipped a few classes, so maybe that might be true. But
Never
I didn't.
admit.
However, when I became a minister, the very first day that I was in the congregation, a lady came into my office and she said, my name is, and she mentioned it, became something like Kekameka something. And she said, it means butterfly woman. And I'm a Cree Indian from Saskatchewan. She was adopted by a Chinese family in the congregation as a young baby. And the parents had always encouraged her to maintain her native identity. So she came into my office and she said, "Can I do smudging with you?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" You know. And so she explained it to me, and she did the little smudging ceremony, where you're familiar with. And she said it's like a cleansing kind of thing. And it was really very, very wonderful. So I learned a lot from her, and we're still in contact with her, about her native background and identity. She keeps in touch with her native community in Toronto. But that was my first really exposure, if you like, to a real life native person, you know, not knowing anything about it. It was wonderful. Thank you.
May I say a few words?
Yes,
Yeah.
please do.
I'm a member of this church, of this congregation. I'd be especially interested to know that I started off life as an Indian missionary. That was my first appointment. The first year I became a minister was 1962, and in those days, you find out where you're going by simply waiting for a piece of paper with names on it to be posted at Knox College. And then you're simply told their name is there and the place is there. And I looked at the place, I know my name of course, and there was a place I was going to, Rolling River Indian Reserve. I thought, oh dear. Anyhow, I thought about that for a few minutes, and in those days, the mission board office, the central offices of the church, were in fact in a large building just 2 doors away from Knox College. And I thought, you know, I've never even met an Indian, never mind ministered to an Indian. So I thought, I'm going to go talk to Jack Cooper, who was the head of home missions. And I would ask him if he could send me on a short course, just so I'll have some idea, some clue of what to do. So I got lucky, walked over there, and Jack happened to be in. And I was interested, I was telling him that I'd just seen my appointment, and I said, I've never even met an Indian in my life. Couldn't the church send me on some sort of short course just to clue me in? And we were both standing at that point, and Jack turned around. There was a cupboard door behind him. He leaned down, picked off the floor, this tiny little pamphlet, blew it and got the dust off it, and said to me, "Here, this will tell you all you need to know." I thought to myself, Jack, what in heaven's name are you doing? But of course, that was it, you know. The word came from on high, so I went in, went back to Knox College. And on the way over, I think I stopped for 20 seconds and read the thing.
Oh my God.
I'm not even sure it needed 20 seconds, but I read it and I thought, oh, good heavens. I thought, well, if this is where we're at, that's where we're at. But that's what happened. For the first year, I was the minister of this church, and that's the background I had, 0. So there was a lot of learning to do. It was a mess, an unbelievable mess. The church services normally had 1 adult woman and 4 to 7 children and a dog present. Once in a while there'd be a second woman, once in a very great while there'd be a man, and once in a in fact only once in the entire year, 2 men came. But each week there was 1 adult, 7 children, a dog. And I thought, well, there's really nothing here, but I did the best I could to the best of my ability. It's interesting, and I decided, regardless of what happens, I'm not going anywhere. In those days, you were on a mission board appointment. It was a 2-year appointment. I thought, I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not asking to move. But it's interesting, the word must have gone out to the Presbyterian, because they moved me after 1 year. I didn't ask to move, but they moved me. So my second year, I didn't do Indian work that time. I was just looking after Southminster Presbyterian Church. But in the second year, I was at Brandon. In addition to being the minister of Southminster Church, they added Birdtail Indian Reserve to my task. In other words, I preached every Sunday at Birdtail. And after that, I went to the Indian school, the Birdle Indian School, and I was a chaplain there, and I spoke to the congregation there as well.
Right.
and no background. You'll be interested, what did a typical day in that second year of Gravin look like? The work looked like this. A Bible class at 9:30. A service at 11. Walk home, have a quick lunch, lay down for 15 minutes, get up, drive 90 miles, take a service at the Birdtail service, get out, drive 20 miles to Birdla Indigenous School, take a service, then drive home. So in the course of one day, I would drive 210 miles, take 3 services, and a Bible class. How much was I paid for that? But how much extra money did I earn for the Birdle School? You guessed, 0. How much extra did the church pay me for taking services at the Birdtail church for 1 year? Again, the answer is 0. The Missionary Society gave me $35 a month, though. Maybe you'd think, well, that's laughably small. Actually, in those days, it wasn't. It was just enough to pay the gas for those trips back.
Yeah.
So I got no pay for it, but at least I didn't need to subsidize it out of my own pocket. And that's what went on. So it's hard to know what to say. The year of the reserve, there was not much there. I felt there was some hostility there that I had picked up for what reason, I don't know. I don't know what the background is. But there's a little footnote to all of this, and there are 2 footnotes to all of that. From what I could tell, I completely wasted the year at that church. But it's interesting. Before I came here, I was living in Ottawa, and just a couple of years before I left Ottawa, I saw an Indian guy at the coffee hour after church. So I got engaged him a bit, and of all things, his name was, I think, Birdtail or whatever, but I knew the name, and I said, how old are you? And he told me, and we worked it out that he was born on the Rolling River Reserve the year I was there.
Oh, my goodness.
Now the final story I'll give you is, for 1 year I was the Director of Studies at Presbyterian College. This was about, 7, 8 years ago, whatever it was. And just at the start of one course I was teaching, one of the women, an older student, was there, and she was telling me before the class started, well, I've just come back from Manitoba, and I was at an Indian conference, and some Indians were there. To which I said, oh, were any of them named Shanakapo? So her jaw just about dropped. How did you know that? I said, well, I used to be an Indian missionary, and I lived on Rolling River Reserve, and that was a name there. And it's interesting what the Shanakapos said. Oh, we don't have a church on the reserve anymore, but we're still Christians, which was an interesting thing. So, an interesting story, and I thought the congregation might be interested in that. One other thing, if I can. I went to Jack, I tell the story. I did tell the story about Jack, did I? Jack Cooper. Yes, no, I've done that. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks.
Having your dinner, where the children all dressed up.
No, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry it took so long.
No, it's good. It's this year, for the first time, the Master of Divinity students at Knox College are going to Saskatoon on a cultural visit. Rachel is part of that group, so we're trying to start paying attention. But yeah, for most of my education, it was the equivalent of being handed a pamphlet. Although the church has done hard work in this area, but there's a long way to go.
Excuse me. I just want to relate a little bit of my personal experience. Growing up in Saskatchewan, as a family, we used to go very far north to the Cold Lakes, where there were only reserves, but we were allowed to go in and fish in the lakes. The Indian people there were friendly, like you said, and they were generous. They filleted fish like you would not believe. They were very watchful of visitors because it was a family. They built cottages for people to stay in. Are you warm? Do you need anything? Genuine and generous. Having said that, you go back to Saskatoon, and I've been gone for many years now, but there was areas of Saskatoon that you did not walk in. And it's not a big city, but you avoided those areas. And it's sort of like reversing the symptoms of poverty. Because these people were homeless, they had major addictions, they were hungry, and there was no help. There really wasn't. Then when I graduated, I had to intern for several months, and my first posting was in Winnipeg, and it was in a children's hospital. And a lot of the Indian children and Eskimo children were brought into the hospital because of cystic fibrosis. And it was amazing. The Eskimo children, mind you, they were further away, but parents were not involved in the treatment. The Indian children, the mother was there. I learned. She wanted to know how to care for her child. It was quite amazing.
Any other thoughts? Jeff?
One of my favorite quotes from page 124, actually, and you start by quoting Ray Aldred. Ray has spoken about the need for settler churches to develop emotional intelligence, and this may be a key point, especially for Reformed churches. The Reformed tradition has a tendency to focus on the head rather than the heart. Ain't that the truth? Aldred argues that emotions lead to healing. Churches that neglect the heart fail to make room for emotion and thus miss an opportunity for healing. Churches must make space for those who are half healed. Churches should embrace emotion and use that emotional energy to connect so that we can move toward harmony with the land, with each other, and with the Creator. First off, I just want to say that was brilliant, and I love it, and I'm really glad it was in your book. Second, I wondered if you could speak a bit to that and what that could look like. Knox Oakville is a rather cerebral congregation, not unlike its siblings in the faith across the denomination. And we like a project, and we like to learn. Anything in here talking about read a book, we're like, all right, good, we can do that. We can show up on a Monday night and do a learning. But then when it comes to the heart, when it comes to the feeling part, which is where the real work of healing and conciliation or reconciliation can happen, sometimes we fall a little short. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to that and what that could look like in worship and beyond worship, and maybe take some of the stigma out of being people who actually are supposed to feel.
Yeah, I love what he says about being half-healed. That Ray Aldred is a Indigenous professor from Vancouver School of Theology, and he had a lot to say about this idea of being half-healed. We like to come to worship and look like we have it all together. This is part of it's part of the Reformed tradition, and I am steeped in it and comfortable in it, and I don't want to get emotional in worship.
Yeah.
But there's something about being able to connect to that half-healed part of us. So whatever parts of us have been traumatized or damaged or injured in the past, I could tell you my own story about being in worship in Knox Oakville. My son Sam, some of you know the story, he died on Thanksgiving weekend in 2007. So the first Sunday in Advent, I'm sitting in worship at Knox and thinking, I can't do this. But I did. I sat there and I watched the children go up to the front for the children's story, and I thought, I can't do this. And I started crying, and I was so uncomfortable because there was no space for my tears in that sanctuary. Even though everyone was so sympathetic and so loving and so kind, I did not feel, as a Presbyterian minister, I did not feel that there was room for me to grieve, as if by grieving I was proclaiming something other than what I preached all those years. As if by grieving I was proclaiming that death had the last word or that hope wasn't possible. So I have thought about this a whole lot in the years since, and that's my example of not having room for being half-healed. It's a hard question. It's a really hard question. You know, how do we overcome that? How do we make space for the heart? You know, one of the things we need to do more in worship is be quiet. Just stop talking. Reformed worship is so word-heavy. There's so many words. Our prayers are full of words. Our preaching is full of words. Our announcements are full of words. Our prayers are full of words. Our hymns, you know, there's no space in the worship service to just let yourself catch up to what's being said. So that's one thing I would say is more silence. Or more space. Yes, of course.
You didn't meet up with Jane Thompson. I did. I broke up a number of times in the choir where I just had to go.
Yeah.
Tears streaming down my eyes.
Yeah, yeah.
And she'd go out and meet me. Oh. And she'd say, I have to go to the bathroom. And she'd come back in a few minutes and say, are you okay now? And I would. So there are people, if they see it happening,
Yeah.
maybe they didn't expect you to. I don't know why not, when you had just lost a very much a part of you.
Well, I think it was more my issue than anybody else's, you know?
It should have been all our issue, really.
Well, what you say is interesting, though, because we don't sit and cry together. We don't
Correct.
sit. There's certain pockets of the congregation where that happens. When small groups will bond in such a way that you can have that kind of emotion. But, I mean, you notice in worship, we sit far apart from each other. We wouldn't know half the time if someone was weeping. And some of us are too fixated to get up and go with someone who's weeping. Because we feel like we're supposed to stay and be calm and be collected and be intellectual.
Or take them out, right?
Or taken out,
Or
yeah.
take them out, right? It's the same with babies that make noise.
Yeah.
We gotta get them out. And I'm like, no, we gotta keep them in.
Yeah,
We have to
yeah.
make space for that.
Yeah, yeah. How do we make space for weeping?
And lament.
And lament.
Something this book brings up, and something, you know, a number of us have been to Calvin.
Yes.
Do you want me to take a mic?
Please.
Or I could be passing this one around.
So you mentioned your Calvin grant.
Yes.
And some of us are very familiar with Calvin because we went a number of one of the things that seemed like a big awakening for me at Calvin was a year that we focused on lament. And I thought, lament, I mean, it's all through the Psalms. How did we miss it? How did we forget that people need to lament? And this book reminds us also that we need to lament. And it's part of being human. And it's part of, you know, terrible, I'm going to do it, but the Buddha apparently says to live is to suffer. And we do suffer. And we sometimes put a fresh coat of paint on that and think we're all better. And it's not that easy.
And sometimes we think it's not faithful to lament.
Right.
I think the other thing is that when we lament, and most of us brought up in the Reformed tradition, we want to do that in a small group. We don't want to do that with 200 people.
Right. You don't want to do that.
So, and that's why, you know, when Mom was weeping or whatever, she would leave, right? And it kind of makes sense to have a place, a quiet place or a small place for 3 or 4 or 5 people. But I don't think I mean, I would be very uncomfortable if I was feeling that. I wouldn't want to stay either. I'd want to get out. I'd be okay with a couple of people, but you don't want to do that as a group. The issue you had was personal. It's not necessarily something you probably wouldn't have been comfortable trying to share with everybody at the instant in time either.
No, that's true.
I mean, I'm just saying the way I would feel is I'd want to go somewhere quiet, and so we need to either have a place or create a space where we can do that. And maybe there's a lot more power in small groups for the type of thing we're talking about, right? It's not easy to do that, or, you know, even interactive worship doesn't work too well with 200 people either, right?
Right, it's challenging, but have you ever been in African American worship?
No, well, only at
Ghana.
at Calvin, right? Yes. I could, and when we were at some of the worship in Ghana, that was more like that.
Yes, yeah.
But you know, we felt kind of out of our element there too. I mean,
Right. I'm sure you did.
there's a lot we can learn from that. I'm just not sure. You know, we have to figure out a way to get to there to do it as a big group.
Yeah, you're right. It's a big jump from where we are
Oh yeah.
to. I tell this story about being at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which was Martin Luther King Jr.'s church. And Rachel's probably heard me tell this story like 8 times now. But it was my first experience of African American worship. And it was my first experience of this kind of emotional energy. I started crying and I couldn't stop for hours, which is not me. You know, it was not me. But there was something about that space that gave me permission to weep. And I'm still trying to guess what it is I was weeping about. I think it was just such a release to be in that kind of space. But you're right, we're not going to leap from being an intellectual place to a heart place in a hurry.
Maybe it's my youth. I'm not as, like, I'm older than I am. But, okay, maybe I'm older than I am, but I'm very young in my spirit. I was Unitarian before coming to this particular church, and they're very expressive, and it's a small group. I'll go with that. But when I came here, I felt safe. Safe enough to give me my permission to talk about things openly, whether it's in a Bible study where we went way over places we never expected to go, to you know, coming in and hearing Jackie's a bit of a firecracker, and that's part of the attraction. But that's because I need to be driven to be put to a test, to think about something. But when we have a really good service going on and the theme and then the music comes and I'm in the choir, I have cried during singing because it was so connected. And it may be later on I'll say, oh, that was because of this, or maybe I'm having a health issue or whatever. It's not any reason. It's because I could feel it and I could really identify with it. And I think it's perfectly fine to see some people that, have to, they take their moment, step away. But at coffee service right afterwards, you can find a lot of almost blubbering idiots when they come down and they go, and I feel, like I had this day and I was so glad to see you and I feel great. Like they're really, and they feel better after they've been down and really communicated. So giving the opportunity and then identifying with some of the themes really makes a difference. So you can do it, and it just that your personal circumstances or you've been, are different from everyone, but you will eventually go through some type of crisis. And at some point, you either hide at home or you come to a safe place. That's how I look at it. And it made a big difference for me currently. So I think that's and I'm more involved in the church because I'm so delighted to see things happen. But music is a good part of it. And that Bible study made me join. Because I was in the Bible study, so, gonna go sing? And I kept, no, it's like I'm new. No, you should join the choir. But it was the best suggestion ever. In the end, I'm not perfect, I'm not a great singer, but I can get through it, and I have great joy in the people that are with me. And you can share a lot there. So taking opportunity and finding the place to find that is more important. And then, this church permits it, and we should continue to, shall we say, invigorate it more. So.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, that's so great to hear that you found a safe space.
This is a safe place.
Could I tell a final story?
Yes, of course. Here comes the microphone.
At the risk of boring you, I'm going to tell you a story. It's one of the reasons I have really no trouble believing in God. And when the story is finished, you'll see where I'm coming from. The time of the story was a year after I left the Indian Reserve. So I was living in Brandon. I'd been away for a year. And then the thought seemed to come out of nowhere that I really should go back and sort of revisit people on the Indian Reserve. I thought, that's kind of an odd thought. They didn't exactly welcome me with open arms, but okay, I'll do that. And it was this perfect, wonderful day. I think it was a Thursday. It was 80 degrees, but it was Manitoba 80. In other words, a dry heat. It couldn't have been better. So I dressed appropriately for that. I had sandals on, shorts, and just a t-shirt. And I got out of the car, I was ready to go, and I just couldn't turn the key. And the feeling I had is I had to go back into the house and dress as a minister, clerical collar, coat, trousers and so on. So I did that, and I was about to turn the key, and I couldn't again do it. And the thought came to me, you need to take your Book of Common Order with you. In other words, this is a service book. And I thought, I need to take the Book of Common Order. I'm just visiting people, but I couldn't turn that key without going back into the house, getting the Book of Common Order, and taking it with me. So there I was, dressed as a minister with clerical collar, my Book of Common Order. I thought, this is crazy, but I turned the key, and I drove the 1 hour north to the Indian Reserve. The idea was just to go around and visit people and so on. And it took about almost exactly an hour to get there. I pulled out of the reserve, and what was happening, I saw about 30 to 50 people clearly gathered around a grave site. They were having a funeral service. So it suddenly flashed in my mind, I know now why God has acted in this way. Dress up, take your book with you. I pulled up, and the whole 50 people moved back, and I moved into the midst. I said, who died? The name was sounded, and I took the funeral service at that point. And I had no idea, never questioned for 1 minute what the voice was telling me to dress in a certain way and to take that book with me. I don't find it hard to believe in God with that sort of experience. So that was it. In fact, that was my last contact with the group of people at that reserve. I thought you'd enjoy this story.
Yes, thank you so much. That's remarkable.
I think so.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. Well, I think I'm just going to pull us to a close here, just thinking that I think the best thing that any of us can do is learn what's nearest to us. So if you like to read, then read and learn. If you're a relationship builder, then, I mean, it sounds so trite, but make friends with an Indigenous person and learn something and try and build those relationships. You know, there's a long way to go. These relationships are really, really broken, and have been for centuries, and we're not going to repair them overnight. But if we can reach out to what's closest to us, then maybe we can take a small step toward conciliation. So thank you so much.
I know I speak for all of us here by saying, Sarah, we thank you so much, not only for your very timely book in this year of learning that a small group of us decided to embark upon because we were not happy with, or we were feeling moved to do something about our land acknowledgement. And this book of yours seemed to just come at the perfect time. And so we thank you so much. You'd almost think God had a hand in it, wouldn't you? So we thank you. We thank you for you sharing your time this evening with us and for your wisdom and your challenge in the book. So thank you. Thank you. That's still live, Gary. I don't know how to turn it off.